Chapter 1. Now, she was here, having just delivered an apology to a triumphant Donald Trump. The lavish grandeur of the Oval Office, with its gilded decor and sweeping drapes, felt strangely oppressive to Katrina Armstrong, a stark contrast to the intellectual calm of academia she had grown accustomed to. Merely a few weeks earlier, she had been walking through the ivy-covered corridors of Columbia University, serving as a highly regarded academic leader and president of one of the nation's most prestigious institutions. Now, she found herself in the heart of American political power, seated across from a smug and assertive Donald Trump, fresh off a political resurgence. The reason for her visit was no minor formality. She had just offered a formal apology, a humiliating act that secured the reinstatement of nearly $400 million in federal funding for Columbia, which had been abruptly revoked following a public uproar over alleged anti-Semitic activity on campus. The price of that lifeline, however, was far more than monetary. "You understand, Katrina," Trump said, his voice reverberating in the high-ceilinged room as he reclined confidently in his chair. "This wasn't just about money. It was about principle, about stamping out the rot." His words, thick with political triumph, seemed to hang in the air like smoke. Katrina could only nod, the muscles in her throat tightening, her composure barely holding under the weight of what she had just done. She had surrendered more than a statement. She had handed over a trove of sensitive documents compiled by Columbia's legal team, damning materials she understood could set off a national controversy. Among the files was evidence that went beyond campus protests or inflammatory student speeches. The documents implied that certain high-profile political figures, including former representatives Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, had played active roles in nurturing a radical anti-Israel faction within the university. It went even further, alleging that they had orchestrated the insertion of provocatively anti-Semitic individuals into highly visible student positions, including athletic teams, to manipulate media coverage and stir political unrest. Katrina knew that once this information was made public, it wouldn't just spark a firestorm. It could alter the trajectory of national discourse and rewrite the rules of academic and political engagement. Chapter 2. Trump's eyes narrowed. "I have every faith in your ability, Madam President, to find the truth and hold accountable those responsible for orchestrating the protest," Armstrong said, her voice calm but carefully measured, each word chosen with the weight of political consequence in mind. Though the statement was delivered with the polished tone of diplomacy, beneath the surface was a tremor of unease. She was now playing a role in a much larger and far more volatile political game, one that could engulf careers, institutions, and reputations. Trump's eyes narrowed sharply, the glint of personal vengeance lighting up his expression. "This Omar and Tlaib," he muttered, his voice edged with scorn. "They thought they could play me like a fiddle, thought I wouldn't catch on to what they were doing, using Columbia as a stage for their anti-American, anti-Israel theatrics." His jaw clenched as he grabbed his phone off the polished Resolute desk, his thumb already moving. "Get me Kash Patel, now." His tone was brisk, commanding. He wasn't asking for a meeting. He was summoning an executioner. Within minutes, the secure line connected, and the voice of FBI Director Kash Patel came through, crisp and attentive. Trump didn't waste a second. "Kash," he said, his tone now steel, "I want a full investigation, top priority. Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, dig into everything. Their links to Columbia, their coordination with student groups, any trace of foreign influence. I want it airtight. Leave no stone unturned, you understand me?" The message was unmistakable. This wasn't just about campus protests anymore. This was personal. This was war. As the president's order set the machinery of federal power into motion, far from Washington, in the heart of Minneapolis, Ilhan Omar stood before a local crowd at a community center, trying to maintain her composure. Her usual radiant smile had dulled, stiffened into something practiced, almost brittle, as reporters and constituents pressed her with cautious but probing questions about the growing Columbia scandal. The media frenzy was already gaining momentum. Whispers had evolved into headlines, seeded by strategic leaks from powerful figures in D.C., and amplified with fervor by conservative news outlets. Omar could feel it, momentum shifting, public sentiment hardening. Though no official charges had been made, the storm was brewing, and she was already bracing for impact. She knew the political tides were turning fast, and this time she might be pulled under. Chapter 3. Trump Ally. These accusations are baseless, a desperate attempt to smear me and distract from the real issues facing this country, Ilhan Omar declared to the press, her voice unwavering and sharp with conviction, a controlled fire burning behind her eyes. The flashing cameras, the tightly packed crowd of journalists, the ambient hum of whispered questions, none of it shook her stance as she stood firm beneath the bright lights, shoulders squared against the storm she knew was gathering strength. I have always stood for justice and peace, for all people, regardless of race, religion, or nationality, she continued, every word calibrated to reach both her base and her critics. She needed this statement to land hard and loud, to cut through the noise erupting from Washington and the media frenzy now mounting by the hour. Her supporters, arranged just behind her, nodded solemnly, their presence a shield and a signal she wasn't backing down. But even as her voice rang out with moral clarity, even as the optics were managed to perfection, a gnawing sense of unease clung to her like smoke from a fire she couldn't yet see. The truth was, Omar understood the depth of the political machine arrayed against her. And she knew that this wasn't just about rhetoric, it was about survival. Across state lines, in Detroit, Representative Rashida Tlaib took a similar stance, addressing constituents with that same defiant energy, her tone bold and indignant as she echoed Omar's words. She denounced the investigation as a politically motivated attack orchestrated by the right-wing establishment, a smear campaign rooted in Islamophobia and an attempt to silence dissent. To the public, the two women appeared united, unshaken, warriors on the front lines of a cultural war. But once the microphones were off and the crowds dispersed, the veneer of confidence began to crack in private. Within the confines of a dimly lit meeting room, the atmosphere between their aides had shifted from fiery determination to barely concealed panic. Leaks from within federal agencies had revealed fragments of the damning evidence that had not only been collected, but meticulously organized and delivered directly to the White House by Columbia University's president, Katrina Armstrong. The trove included a sprawling dossier, transcripts of encrypted messages intercepted through campus networks, questionable financial transactions flagged by internal auditors, and a series of testimonies from both students and faculty implicating the Congresswomen in what was being framed as a coordinated effort to radicalize student protests for political gain. Some of the testimony even pointed toward the deliberate embedding of ideologically extreme individuals into campus life, particularly within the athletic department and student government, as part of a strategy to provoke confrontation, generate headlines, and manipulate media narratives. What had begun as a student protest over geopolitical issues had now metastasized into a federal investigation with tentacles reaching into Congress. At the heart of the investigation stood Kash Patel, recently appointed FBI director and a trusted enforcer of Donald Trump's political will. A controversial figure with a reputation for unflinching loyalty and aggressive tactics, Patel took Trump's directive with grim resolve. He wasted no time marshaling bureau resources, launching an expansive probe into the Columbia University unrest and the alleged roles played by Omar and Tlaib. Patel ordered his agents into action with surgical precision, tasking specialized units to comb through thousands of emails, financial records, and private communications tied to the university's political and activist groups. The operation was as public as it was deliberate, an unmistakable show of federal power. Dozens of agents appeared on Columbia's campus, some in plain clothes, others in full tactical gear, setting up command posts and interviewing professors, deans, and student leaders from dawn to dusk. Subpoenas flew like confetti, and within days, the university transformed into a pressure cooker of suspicion and fear. Students whispered anxiously in lecture halls, professors canceled controversial courses, and activist groups suddenly found their meeting rooms under surveillance. What was once a vibrant intellectual space had become the epicenter of a national crisis, its soul weighed down by the crushing gravity of political vendetta. The university's reputation teetered on the edge as media outlets from both sides of the aisle descended, each spinning their own narrative of betrayal, overreach, or reckoning. The conservative press painted a picture of moral decay within liberal academia, of elected officials corrupting young minds with radical ideologies under the guise of activism. On the other hand, progressive voices framed the crackdown as authoritarian overreach, an attempt by Trump and his loyalists to silence dissent, weaponize federal agencies, and manufacture a scandal for political gain. Meanwhile, Armstrong, who had set these events in motion with the release of Columbia's internal findings, remained largely silent, retreating from the spotlight. Though her actions had preserved the university's federal funding, they had also marked her as a key figure in one of the most consequential political investigations of the decade. Some hailed her as a principled leader who chose truth over comfort, while others condemned her as a coward who had capitulated to political pressure and sacrificed civil liberties in the process. Behind her stoic facade, Armstrong was racked with internal conflict. She had not anticipated how swiftly the federal government would act on the materials she provided, nor the sheer scale of the operation it would unleash. What she intended as transparency was now being used as fuel for a broader political firestorm that threatened to consume not just individuals, but the very principles of academic freedom and democratic dissent. Across the country, the political consequences reverberated with increasing intensity. Right-wing lawmakers seized the opportunity to call for congressional hearings, pushing legislation to impose stricter oversight on universities receiving federal funds, especially those deemed to be harboring ideological extremism. Centrist Democrats began distancing themselves from Omar and Tlaib, quietly removing past endorsements and sidestepping questions about their association. On the progressive left, there was fury and disbelief. Supporters of the Congresswomen viewed the entire affair as a calculated purge, a pre-election power play designed to fracture the Democratic base and shift public focus away from policy debates to a manufactured culture war. Ilhan Omar, once a rising star within the party, found herself increasingly isolated, fielding frantic calls from donors and civil rights organizations trying to assess the damage and plan a defense. Tlaib, too, began reconfiguring her legal team, bringing in high-powered attorneys and crisis communications experts as whispers of potential indictments grew louder. The sense of urgency grew by the day, each new leak from the FBI investigation threatening to detonate another round of media scrutiny and public backlash. And all the while, Trump watched from the White House with satisfaction, his gambit unfolding exactly as planned. By positioning himself as the defender of national integrity and the avenger of anti-Semitism, he had not only revitalized his base, but also driven a wedge deep into the Democratic coalition. The wheels of his vision of justice were in full motion now, relentless, unapologetic, and calculated to the last detail. Chapter 4. Trump seized on the findings. Armstrong, caught in the eye of the storm she had unwittingly helped create, felt a deepening sense of dread settle into her bones, heavier with each passing day. When she had made the fateful decision to hand over Columbia's internal investigative documents to the White House, she had done so believing it was a necessary step, one that, while difficult, would ultimately help restore the university's integrity and secure the future of its students. In her mind, exposing the truth about external political interference was a means to an end, a way to distance Columbia from the escalating chaos and safeguard its federal funding, which had been stripped away with punishing speed after the anti-Semitism allegations made national headlines. But what Armstrong hadn't anticipated, what she couldn't control, was how quickly and explosively the situation would escalate once it left her hands. Trump and his allies had seized on the documents not as a matter of institutional repair, but as a weapon, a political cudgel to strike down adversaries and ignite a broader cultural war. Now, watching the relentless news coverage, the protests outside her office, and the growing unease rippling through faculty and students alike, Armstrong realized with chilling clarity that the consequences of her decision were far beyond her grasp. She had lit a match, but someone else was pouring the gasoline. The investigation, once a quiet legal inquiry, had morphed into a full-blown federal offensive. Kash Patel's FBI task force worked at lightning speed, combing through digital records, conducting cross-state interviews, and connecting financial dots that led to disturbing conclusions. Evidence began to mount, linking several student organizations at Columbia to nonprofits and advocacy groups with ties to Omar and Tlaib. These were not obscure, distant associations. Some of the funding appeared to be direct, supported by receipts, wire transfers, and internal emails suggesting deliberate coordination. The implication was clear. The protests had not been spontaneous eruptions of student anger, but part of a larger orchestrated campaign, one that now appeared to have had political fingerprints all over it. Former staffers, students, and even disillusioned activists began coming forward, some under the promise of immunity, offering testimony that bolstered the emerging narrative. They describe meetings where protest strategies were planned, emails where outside talking points were distributed, and conversations in which Omar and Tlaib allegedly encouraged a more confrontational posture on campus to provoke administrative overreach and trigger a national media spectacle. Whether the full truth aligned with this narrative no longer seemed to matter. The political machine had shifted into high gear, and Trump, never one to miss a theatrical moment, went fully on the offensive. In a primetime televised address carried live across all major networks, he stood behind the presidential podium, flanked by American flags and aides with steely expressions, his voice booming with righteous indignation. These radical leftists, he didará, sedwathists, he declared, his tone rising with every word, tried to undermine our great nation, to sow division and hate from within our own institutions of learning. They plotted, they funded, they encouraged the chaos we witnessed at Columbia University. Pausing for dramatic effect, he leaned into the microphone. This is more than campus unrest. This is treason. The word hit like a thunderclap. He called for the immediate prosecution of Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, demanding that the Department of Justice bring charges against them for their alleged role in destabilizing a federally funded institution and using taxpayer dollars to, in his words, fuel a campaign of anti-Semitic hate. The address sent shockwaves across the nation. In Washington, political lines hardened further, with Republicans rallying behind Trump's fiery rhetoric and demanding swift legal action, while Democrats scrambled to assess the fallout. Some progressive lawmakers came to Omar and Tlaib's defense, denouncing the entire affair as a dangerous precedent, a chilling weaponization of law enforcement against political rivals. But others remained conspicuously silent, wary of the mounting evidence and afraid to appear sympathetic to what was quickly being framed as a national security threat. News outlets ran continuous coverage, dissecting every piece of leaked testimony, every transaction record, every archived tweet or public statement that might retroactively serve as a smoking gun. Armstrong watched it all unfold with growing despair. Her intentions, once rooted in preserving Columbia's reputation and integrity, had been twisted into something unrecognizable. The university, instead of being seen as a victim of external manipulation, was now painted as a breeding ground for extremism. Donors were withdrawing, faculty were resigning, and student morale had collapsed into fear and mistrust. Columbia's name was dragged into hearings, its leadership questioned, its mission distorted. She sat alone in her office late at night, lights dimmed, staring at the framed diplomas and photographs lining the walls, symbols of a legacy now imperiled. She had tried to protect the institution she loved, but in doing so, she had unleashed a force that not only threatened its future, but risked tearing the nation even further apart, pushing political discourse beyond the point of reconciliation. What haunted her most was the realization that even if truth eventually surfaced, no matter which side it favored, the damage had already been done. The country had chosen its sides, facts be damned, and now everything, from academia to government to public trust, was caught in the crossfire. Chapter 5. FBI's findings. The political backlash that followed the indictments was both immediate and volcanic, a seismic rupture that split the country even more deeply along its already fraying partisan lines. Democrats across the spectrum, from progressive firebrands to centrist stalwarts, rushed to the defense of Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, decrying the charges as nothing more than a politically motivated assault, orchestrated by a vindictive president intent on silencing opposition. They accused Donald Trump of weaponizing the Department of Justice, of turning the FBI into his personal tool of retribution, and of manufacturing a legal crisis to galvanize his base ahead of the upcoming election. Press conferences were hastily arranged, fiery speeches filled the halls of Congress, and civil rights organizations issued scathing statements, warning that the nation was sliding into authoritarianism. Protesters flooded the streets in major cities, waving signs that read, "Dissent is not treason," and "Hands off our voices," while social media erupted in a frenzy of hashtags and calls to action. Prominent Democratic leaders invoked chilling historical parallels, warning that this was a dangerous precedent, one that echoed the darkest chapters of American political persecution. But Trump, emboldened by the FBI's findings and riding a wave of renewed support from his base, did not waver. On the contrary, he leaned into the storm, framing the indictments as a landmark moment in the fight against domestic extremism. In a series of triumphant appearances, he declared that the justice system was finally cleaning house, rooting out what he described as radical ideologues hiding behind the veneer of progressive politics. He praised FBI Director Kash Patel for his unwavering commitment to uncovering the truth, asserting that the investigation had exposed not only illegal activity, but a broader conspiracy to destabilize the country from within. The charges brought against Omar and Tlaib were severe: conspiracy to incite unrest, funding terrorism through proxy organizations, and using their political influence to shield subversive activity. The evidence, Patel assured the public, was overwhelming. Encrypted communications, financial links to international advocacy groups labeled as extremist, and first-hand accounts from whistleblowers who claimed to have been directed by aides to deliberately provoke confrontations on campus. With these explosive charges now official, the stage was set for one of the most sensational trials in modern American history. The courtroom became a battleground of ideologies as much as legal arguments, swarmed daily by reporters, protesters, and political commentators. The media dubbed it the trial of the century, a label that wasn't far from the truth given its national implications. Cameras camped outside the courthouse day and night, live coverage became non-stop, and every development was dissected on primetime news panels. The prosecution wasted no time building their case. They presented a meticulously structured narrative that painted Omar and Tlaib as calculating political operatives who had exploited the chaos at Columbia University, not for justice, but for personal and ideological gain. They showcased emails suggesting coordination between student protest leaders and political operatives, bank transfers from political action committees to organizations later connected to the protests, and statements from insiders who testified that both representatives had greenlit strategies to escalate tensions on campus. To the prosecution, this was not merely activism, it was manipulation, a cold and calculated effort to inflame public outrage for political leverage. The defense countered with equal intensity, arguing that the entire case rested on circumstantial evidence stitched together by a politically motivated administration. They pointed out that the financial links were tenuous at best, typical of the kind of support lawmakers often offer to grassroots movements. The communications, they argued, were taken out of context, cherry-picked to support a preordained narrative. Most critically, they emphasized that advocating for Palestinian rights, criticizing Israel's policies, and supporting student protests, no matter how controversial, were not crimes under the Constitution. The defense argued that Trump's administration had deliberately blurred the line between dissent and sedition, using the machinery of government to crush political opposition. They highlighted Trump's repeated public statements calling for their prosecution, even before indictments were handed down, suggesting that the outcome had been predetermined. But despite their efforts, the momentum seemed to be against them. The weight of the evidence, whether decisive or simply voluminous, created a narrative difficult for the jury to ignore. After weeks of testimony, expert analysis, emotional appeals, and intense cross-examinations, the trial came to a close under a cloud of national tension. The jury, after deliberating for several days, returned a verdict that sent a shockwave through the country. Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib were found guilty on multiple counts, including conspiracy to incite unrest and misappropriation of funds connected to terrorist-linked organizations. The courtroom erupted. Some gasped in disbelief, others cheered with vindication. The news spread across the country like wildfire, and reactions were immediate and visceral. For Trump and his supporters, it was a triumphant moment. Standing on the south lawn of the White House with flags billowing behind him, Trump gave a victory speech laced with bravado and certainty. "Justice has been served," he declared, his voice ringing with triumph. For too long, these radical leftists thought they were above the law. They tried to tear our country apart from the inside, but no more. This verdict is not just a win for me, it's a win for America. A win for law, for order, and for every American who believes in truth. He promised sweeping new measures to root out radicalism in every institution, hinting at future investigations and legislation that would tighten federal oversight on universities, nonprofits, and political organizations suspected of harboring extremist ideologies. His approval ratings surged overnight, and Republicans emboldened by the verdict began rolling out plans for a new Patriot Protection Act aimed at expanding surveillance powers and curbing what they described as ideologically motivated sabotage. But for many others across the country, the verdict felt like a betrayal of the democratic ideals they believed in. Protests reignited in major cities, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and Washington, D.C., drawing tens of thousands into the streets. Legal scholars issued dire warnings about the implications for free speech and political dissent. Prominent voices in the media and academia framed the outcome as the death knell for pluralism and principled opposition in the United States. Omar and Tlaib's supporters vowed to fight back, launching appeals and civil rights campaigns, while civil liberties organizations prepared to challenge the convictions at the Supreme Court. And in the middle of it all, Katrina Armstrong watched with a heavy heart. Her university, her reputation, and the fragile hope she once had of restoring order now seemed irrelevant in the face of what her actions had unleashed. The consequences of her decision, born of duty and desperation, had played out far beyond the halls of Columbia. They had reshaped the national conversation, redefined the limits of political dissent, and cemented a moment in history that would be debated, mourned, and mythologized for decades to come. Chapter 6. Trump basked in his victory. Katrina Armstrong sat in her office, the soft glow of the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor, her eyes fixed on the muted television screen where pundits debated the fallout of the Omar and Tlaib convictions. The volume was low, but the images were enough. Trump standing proudly at a podium, flanked by American flags and roaring crowds, while headlines scrolled beneath him proclaiming victory, justice, and the end of radical influence in higher education. Armstrong watched with a complex tangle of emotions threading through her chest. Relief, certainly, but also an aching, inescapable regret that refused to leave her. Columbia's federal funding had been restored. The lifeline she had fought for so desperately had arrived. Professors could resume their research, students their studies, programs their outreach. On the surface, the university had begun to heal. The protests had quieted, the external scrutiny had eased, and for the first time in months, the administration was no longer scrambling to contain daily PR crises. But beneath that fragile calm was a deeper fracture, one that Armstrong feared might never fully mend. She had made a deal, one she had hoped would buy time, preserve stability, and shield the institution from collapse. But that deal had come at an unspoken cost, one that now felt etched into the very foundation of the university. She had given Trump the ammunition he needed, believing, perhaps naively, that truth and transparency would be used to correct, not destroy. Instead, she had watched as the machinery of political power turned that truth into a battering ram, wielded not with surgical precision, but with reckless, devastating force. What had begun as an effort to root out dangerous influences had morphed into a national spectacle, a purge, a crusade that had consumed not just Omar and Tlaib, but the ideals Columbia stood for: intellectual freedom, political expression, and the right to dissent. In choosing to protect the university's future, Armstrong had sacrificed its soul, and the weight of that choice pressed against her like a stone. Meanwhile, in Washington, Donald Trump basked in the glow of his latest triumph. His posture relaxed and confident as he fielded questions at a press briefing, the subtle smirk on his face betraying his satisfaction. The convictions had validated his claims, silenced many of his critics, and reignited the loyalty of his base with a ferocity unseen since his re-election. In his eyes, this was more than a legal win. It was a moral one. He had rid the system of what he called radical leftist rot, restored control over an elite academic institution, and once again demonstrated his mastery over a political system that so many had once believed he could never tame. He stood tall not just as a president, but as a self-fashioned warrior for justice, a man who had defied the media, the opposition, and the so-called deep state to deliver what he saw as nothing short of a national exorcism. The crowds adored him for it. The headlines celebrated or condemned him, depending on the network, and Trump drank in the moment, like a king surveying a conquered realm. To him, there was no ambiguity, no nuance, no moral compromise, only victory. He, the good guy, had won. In his mind, he had saved America once more from the brink, cleansing it of internal threats and restoring its values. He saw himself as the last line of defense, the only one willing to do what was necessary, no matter how brutal, no matter how controversial. The smile on his lips was not just one of satisfaction. It was the smile of someone who believed, absolutely and without question, that history would remember him not just as a leader, but as a savior.